The issur of Sha'atnez appears twice in the Torah. Once in this week's Parashat, the Torah says, Lo tilbash Sha'atnez shemer ufishtim yachdav, which clearly defines the issur. A person is not allowed to wear wool, referring to a lamb's wool or sheep's wool. Other types of wool are permitted, and not including the issur, and pishtim, and linen. And they can't wear them yachdav. Yachdav teaches us that the two things actually have to be joined together in order to violate the issur. The issur appears earlier on in the Torah in Parashat Kedoshim. It says, "Beged kelaim Sha'atnez lo yale alecha." There it doesn't mention semush pishtim, but it does still say the word Sha'atnez. What does the word Sha'atnez mean? So here Chazal in the Mishnah in Kilayim take the word as an acronym for three different words. Shua, which means it's smooth. Rashi explains it has to be combed until the fibers are smooth. Tavui, which means it has to be woven into a thread. And nuz, which Rashi explains means it has to be bound together. There are different other explanations in the Rishonim, but that's the way Rashi explains. Now here there's a major machloket amongst the Rishonim when these three processes are actually necessary in order to violate the issur of Sha'atnez. Both Rambam and Rashi explain that in order to violate the issur of Sha'atnez, both the wool and the linen, this process to be done to both of them together. That's how the wool and the linen are to be joined together, through the process of combing them together and then joining them together in the single thread, and also then binding them together. That's the way the Rashi and the Rambam explain that this is the way in which the wool and the linen are joined together. Rabbeinu Tam and many other Rishonim argue. They say it's not true. The idea of Sha'atnez is, first of all, each material separately has to be prepared through shua, tavoi, venuz. So you have to create threads and fibers of wool and threads and fibers of linen, but then they can be joined through any way you like, and that's how the person would violate the issur of Sha'atnez. Tosfot brings an excellent proof for their claim. The Gemara says that from the Pesukim this week's Parasha, which immediately after the mention of the issur of Sha'atnez, the Torah says, in the very next pasuk, "Gedilim taseh lacha ala bakavot kasutcha chesachaseh ba," which is the mitzvah of putting tzitzit onto the four corners of a person's garment. From the juxtaposition between the issur of Sha'atnez and the mitzvah of tzitzit, Chazal learned that it is permitted to wear Sha'atnez on one's tzitzit. Tzitzit, the actual techelet, has to be made from wool, and it's even permitted to make tzitziot, which are made of wool, on a garment which is made of pishtan. Why is that? How do we know it's permitted? From the juxtaposition of the two pesukim. Now, how are the tzitziot connected to the beged? Not through the process of shua, tavoi, venuz. It's just a knot connecting the two things together. So Torah says, from the fact that you needed this whole limud to teach me that it was permitted by tzitzit, you also learned that were it not for the mitzvah tzitzit, it would be issur. So you see that any type of connection that connects the wool and the linen is included in the prohibition. L'chora, it's a winning raya. What on earth would Rashi and the Rambam say? So the truth is that the Rambam agrees. Surprisingly, the Rambam says explicitly in Hilchot Kilayim, when he's discussing the issur of Sha'atnez, he says explicitly that you learn from tzitzit that any form of connection between the wool and the linen would incur a prohibition of Sha'atnez. And l'chora, the Rambam totally contradicts himself, because the Rambam is the opinion that just explicitly states earlier on in the chapter that in order to violate the prohibition, you need to actually combine the wool and linen through the process of Sha'atnez, of shua, tavoi, venuz. But the Rambam also accepts what Tosfot's saying, that even tying them together would be the prohibition. So what? How do we resolve this contradiction? So in order to understand what's going on here, we need to sort of plunge a little bit into the nature of the prohibition of Sha'atnez. The Rishonim discuss the following question. If there's a garment that already contains Sha'atnez, let's say it's a linen garment and there's some wool inside. So Rishonim ask, is there any additional prohibition to start adding in more and more wool? Or do we say that once it's a beged that has Sha'atnez in, that's the end of the story? So on Menachos, there's a book of one of the Rishonim. It's attributed to Rashba, but it's not actually the Rashba. It's clear it's not the Rashba. But it's a parish which often says on it Chidushei Rashba. In that parish, the Rashba is discussing the mitzvah of tzitzis and says explicitly that once you have a beged which contains Sha'atnez, there is no longer any additional prohibition to add in more Sha'atnez. What's the case he's discussing? He's discussing the case of tzitzit. We know the Torah permitted, as we mentioned, to add in woolen threads of techelet onto a linen garment. Says the Rashba, once anyway the Torah has permitted that, so you can add in as much more Sha'atnez as you like, since the Torah said that Sha'atnez is permitted. So it makes no difference if there's a little bit of Sha'atnez or if there's a lot of Sha'atnez. It's all the same thing. Tosfot in Yavamas, and also the Rashba himself in Yavamas, clearly argued this. Tosfot says, it's true by Sitza, he agrees to the halacha, but says for a totally different reason. Not because it makes no difference, but because if we see that the Torah permitted for the mitzvah of Sitzis to add in Sha'atnez, then it's probably also permitted, there must be the Torah also permitted, gave a special dispensation, also to add more additional threads of wool. But it's a special dispensation. Really, otherwise it would be issur. And the Rashba there in Yavamas says explicitly, even if the Torah allows some threads of wool for the mitzvah of tzitzis, it wouldn't allow any more, because any more would be an additional violation of the prohibition. So there's clearly a machloket amongst the Rishonim, whether once a garment is already kilayim, is there an issur to start adding in more kilayim into that garment? What's the Yesoda machloket? What are they really arguing about? So if we try and understand what's really going on in the opinion of the Miyuchas LeRashba in Menachot, that it makes no difference. The Achronim compare it to a case of an animal which is a treifa. An animal which, let's say, is missing a certain vital organ, so some sort of significant mum, makes that animal into a treifa, and then it's issur to eat such an animal. What happens if an animal's a treifa because it's missing one leg, and then somebody chops off another leg, and then another leg, and another leg? Is it more issur? No, it's all a treifa. It doesn't make any difference how many different reasons there are to define the animal as a treifa. The prohibition of eating a treifa is once the animal is defined as a treifa, then it's issur to eat it. In other words, there are really two stages when we're talking about treifa. The first stage is define the animal as a treifa, and then any animal which is defined as a treifa, so it's issur to eat it. It would seem that the Rashba in Yavamas, the Miyuchas LeRashba in Menachos, understands Sha'atnez to be exactly the same thing. The first stage is defining the Tetze of the garment as a garment of Sha'atnez, a beged kilayim, a beged Sha'atnez. As once there's even a single thread of wool in a linen garment, that entire garment is now defined as a beged of Sha'atnez. Once something is defined as a beged of Sha'atnez, so there's a prohibition to wear it. It makes no difference if you now add in more threads. It's just more reasons to define the beged as a whole as a beged of Sha'atnez, but there's no additional prohibition. The prohibition is to wear a beged, which is a Tetze de issur, a Tetze of kilayim. What then do Tosfot and the Rashba in Yavamas, what do they hold? So apparently they don't hold of these two stages. The prohibition is an issur on the gavra, to wear simultaneously, together, both wool and linen. And the prohibition relates to the person wearing the wool and wearing the linen. So every additional thread of wool, or every additional thread of linen means the person is wearing more Sha'atnez and more Sha'atnez and more Sha'atnez. It's all contained in one garment, but that's not the point. The prohibition is on the gavra to wear each and every fiber of or thread of wool and linen together. And that's really the machloket here between the Rishonim. Do we see Sha'atnez as beginning as an issur Tetze, as defining the beged as a Tetze de issur because it contains Sha'atnez, and then it's issur for the gavra to wear it? Or is it entirely really an issur on the gavra not to wear wool and linen simultaneously in a single action? Another expression of this machloket between the Rishonim is the discussion in the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi discusses a case of a garment that contains Sha'atnez, but only on one part of it. It's a very large, long garment, and on one end there is some Sha'atnez. and the person is wearing the garment, but he's wearing the other end of the garment, and the part of the garment that actually contains Sha'atnez is resting on the floor. It's not really being carried by the person. He's not really wearing it. It's attached to what he's wearing, but he's not actually wearing that part of the garment. Is that included in the prohibition of Sha'atnez? So the Yerushalmi says, quotes the pasuk in this week's Parashat, Lo Ya'aleh Alecha, and it says, that includes even a case like this, and it is prohibited to wear such a garment, even though the actual Sha'atnez is not being worn, it's just still resting on the ground. Why should such a thing be issur? So, l'chorah is direct continuation of what we said in the Rashba in Menachot. If you understand that once there's a bit of Sha'atnez in the garment, the entire beged is now defined as a beged of Sha'atnez and becomes a chefsed issur. So then it doesn't really matter whether the person's wearing that bit of the garment or not. The entire garment became issur and therefore could not be worn. That l'chorah is the explanation of the Yerushalmi. What then would Tosfot and the Rashba and Yavamas, what would they say if they think it's just an issur gavra? It's a gavra for me to wear woolen linen at the same time. Here the person's not wearing them. So we could suggest one of three different explanations. But l'chorah, it shouldn't be issur. L'chorah, according to them, the issur is to wear woolen linen at the same time. And here, when the woolen linen which are mixed together are lying on the floor, so the person is not wearing them, and so therefore the case Yerushalmi should be permitted. How would they then explain Yerushalmi? So either they could say it's a machloket. Maybe it's a machloket between the Bavli and Yerushalmi, and they hold the Bavli argues with Yerushalmi. Some achronim, and the Drisha suggests that the Yerushalmi is true, he had paskan like it, but it's only true midirabanan. The midiraisa, it's even the Yerushalmi holds it's permitted. A third option, which some of the achronim suggest, is maybe our assumption isn't correct. Maybe even if part of the garment is lying on the floor, since the person is wearing the garment at the end of the day, he's considered to be wearing the entire garment, even the part that's lying on the floor. It's a bit difficult to say that, but it's also possible. Okay, so if so, we really have a major machloket between the Rishonim, maybe it's even a machloket Bavli Yerushalmi, about what the nature of Sha'atnez is. Is it nissa on the chefs of the beged, which becomes a beged Sha'atnez, or is it a prohibition on the gavra to be wearing both at the same time together? If that's true, we can get back to the Rambam. How can the Rambam at the same time say that you need Sha'atnez, Shua, Tavoy, Nuz, between both the Sema and the Pishtim together? They have to be combined together through these processes in order to violate the prohibition. And at the same time say, no, actually any sort of connection, even a knot, like in Tzitzit, will be sufficient. So Reb Chaim suggested in the Rambam that the Rambam has two different dinim, svei dinim of Sha'atnez. There are two ways to create the prohibition of Sha'atnez. One is to directly combine the wool and the linen together using shua tavoy v'nuz, and then the entire beged is defined as a beged of Sha'atnez. The other way is that even if the two things are not combined together, it isn't one chefsa of Sha'atnez, but any time the person is considered to be wearing both wool and linen together, and together means any form of connection between the two, then he also violates the prohibition of wearing Sha'atnez. Now obviously the question immediately arises, why do you need two dinim? If I already violate the prohibition any time I'm wearing both wool and linen together, which are connected in any way, so what's the advantage? What do I gain by saying there's another side of the prohibition, which is where they are fully combined using shua tavoy v'nuz? So to answer that, we have to carry on with another couple of nafkaminas. The Gemara in Nida, also in Avodah discuss a case where a person had a garment of wool and a bit of pishtan got lost and mixed up in the fibers of wool. So there's a tiny amount of pishtan, but it's lost and you can't identify where it is. So the Gemara says that's issur. Even though you can't identify it, at the end of the day, here you have wool and linen. The Rishonim asked the basic question, why don't we say here bitul barov? It should be nullified, just as if you drop a small piece of milk to a big pot of meat. So if it's a small enough amount, 1 in 60, then it's nullified. Why don't we say that also by Sha'atnez? So the Rishonim, both in Nida and Avodah Zarah, Tosfot Arosh explicitly in Nida and Meiri and Avodah Zarah say, it's not shaykh to talk about bittul when you're talking about Sha'atnez. What is Sha'atnez? the prohibition on the mixture. The Torah prohibited the mixture itself, and therefore it doesn't make sense to say that because it's mixed together it could become permitted. But Tosfot HaRosh takes it one stage further. He says, why is that true, and why is that different to other types of mixtures? Because here, the presence of even a small amount of pishtan mixed into the wool defines the entire garment as a garment of Sha'atnez. It's irrelevant if you can't identify where the pishtan is. If you know this pishtan mixed in with this wool, then this is by definition a garment of Sha'atnez, and therefore the entire garment is prohibited. Tosfot, just read his lashon. He says, "Afilu orech habeged 1,000 amot, it's 1,000 amot long. V'yesh bo chut shel kilaim mitzad acher." And on the other side of the garment, far away, there's a single thread of pishtan. The whole thing is issur, and therefore it's not shaykh to talk about bitul barov. And that's the explanation of the Gemara. Now, if we were to say that the prohibition of Sha'atnez is just an issur on the gavra to wear the two things at the same time, so that means the person's act of wearing has to relate both to the wool and to the linen. If you can't identify where the linen is, you can't identify where the pishtan is, so then we would expect to say bitul barov, we would think such a case like this would be permitted. Now, on this question, it seems that the Rambam paskins like both sides of the coin. The Rambam in Hilchos Kilayim Perek Yud Halacha Zayin paskins straight out that if a person had a leather garment and it was mixed in somewhere a small amount of wool and a small amount of pishtan and you can't identify it, we do say bitul barov. We say that it's batel and you can't identify it, so the whole thing becomes permitted. The Ravid gets upset to the Rambam and says it's against the halacha. And the Gemara explicitly says that such a case is prohibited because we don't say bitul barov. The problem is the Rambam agrees with the Gemara. The Rambam even paskins that Gemara. Later on in the same perek, the Rambam paskins that we do not say bitul barov by kilayim. So we have one Rambam in Halacha Yud that says that we can say bitul barov, and a few halachas later in Chaf Zayin, the Rambam says you cannot have bitul barov. What's the justification? So there are a few different ways to solve this contradiction, but according to Reb Chaim, everything works out kamin chomer. Why? When the Rambam says it is bitul barov, what was the case? The case was not where the wool and the linen were joined together through the process of shua tavoy v'nuz. It was a leather garment, and mixed in there was attached to it both wool and linen. They weren't even attached to each other, the wool and linen. So for the Rambam, in that case, it's asa for the person to wear both the wool and the linen at the same time. If he can't identify them, he's not considered to be wearing them, and therefore it's permitted. What's the case where the Rambam agrees it's asa? That's a wool garment where there's linen mixed in with it and combined through shua tavoy v'nuz. In that case, the Rambam says, now the entire beged becomes Sha'atnez and it's prohibited to wear. So that's really the advantage or the extra halacha that comes out of saying there are two dinim here. If we're dealing with a beged which is Sha'atnez, where the wool and linen are actually combined, so the whole beged is defined as a chefsed issur, and even if you can't identify where the pishtan is, it's still asur. But if we're dealing with a case where the wool and the linen are not combined, so they can't be identified, so then they can't be an issur gavra, and therefore become permitted. Now, if the Rambam has two dinim, and there already are two different types of Sha'atnez, you could ask, so what's the source for these two issurim? And here, it seems very, very clear, there are two parashot in the Torah, and if we read very carefully the two parashot in the Torah, we see that they are really the source of these two dinim. The psukim in Kodshim focus entirely on the cheftza of the garment. It says, beged kilayim, it begins with a cheftza, there's a beged kilayim Sha'atnez, lo ya'ale alecha. It seems that in the passive, the whole focus is on the cheftza. Whereas in this week's parasha it says, lo tilbash Sha'atnez, seven pishtim yachdav, the focus is on the action of the gavra. It begins with the action of the gavra, the whole focus is on the action of the gavra. But it's not just that. In this week's parasha it says, lo tilbash Sha'atnez, seven pishtim yachdav, it defines the action of wearing sema and pishtim together. Both sema and pishtim are mentioned separately. Whereas in Parashat Kedoshim, they're not mentioned separately. It just says, don't wear beged kilayim. the word beged doesn't even appear in this week's parasha. It just says the prohibition is wearing tzemeh and pishtim when they are yachdab, which means they're connected in some form. So we're seeing this week's parasha as a source of the idea of an issur on the gavra. And any way in which tzemeh and pishtim are connected, then there's an issur on the gavra to wear them at the same time. Whereas in Parashat Kedoshim, where the focus is on a beged kilaim, and the problem is a beged kilaim should not be upon a person, it should not be worn by the person, and therefore the focus is on the definition of a beged kilaim. We might add that we said, what was the proof that any sort of chibur would be asur? We said from the fact that the Torah permitted wearing kilaim on tzitzit. So the source of that permission is actually this week's parasha, in exactly the right place. The next pasuk after Sha'atnez in this week's parasha is about the mitzvah of putting on tzitzit. And the type of prohibition a person violates when he puts wool threads onto a linen garment is the prohibition of connecting him in any way, just tying a knot, which is exactly the prohibition mentioned in this week's parasha. In addition, if we look at the previous pasuk in both cases, in Kedoshim, the previous prohibition was the issur of kilai behemot, but there it was talking about taking two animals and mating them together. One must join them together to a new object, the offspring of such a union. Whereas this week's parasha, when it talks about the prohibition of kilai behemot, it doesn't talk about mating them together. It talks about lo tachrosh shor uvachamor yachdav. Person can't do charisha with the two of them together. He's not creating a new chefza, but he is relating to both animals and doing one action with both animals at the same time. There's another distinction between the two parashiot, and that is the verb used. In Parashat Kedoshim, it doesn't talk about wearing, about tilbash. It talks about ya'aleh, aliyah, Allah. It can't be upon a person, can't be put up upon a person. Whereas in this week's parasha, the prohibition is lilbosh, to actually wear. What's the difference? So here we could get back to what we mentioned before about a person wearing a long garment where some of that garment is actually resting on the floor. We suggested that if a person is wearing a very long garment, but part of the garment is actually resting on the floor, so he's not really wearing the part that's on the floor. So then why did the Yerushalmi say it's asa? So if we pay attention to Yerushalmi, it's asa based on the word in this week's parasha, lo ya'al, based on the pasuk in Parashat Kedoshim, lo ya'aleh alecha. Even though a person isn't wearing the bit of Sha'atnez which is on the floor, but the entire garment has now been turned to a beged kilaim, and a beged kilaim can't be upon a person at all. But if we asked, is a person actually wearing the bit of Sha'atnez on the floor? He's not. So what would be the nafkamina? What happens if a person had a garment which was not of wool and linen? It was a silk garment or any other material, and at one end of that garment there was a piece of wool and linen. So based on what we're saying, so in such a case, since it's not beged, the beged isn't entirely a beged of wool and linen, so the prohibition of wearing such a beged is only because of the pasuk in this week's parasha, lo tilbash, not to wear wool and linen at the same time. But if it was resting on the floor, the person isn't wearing it, and therefore he wouldn't incur the prohibition of wearing of lo tilbash tzemeh pishtim yachdav. So to summarize, we've seen that there are two separate dinim of Sha'atnez based on the two parashiot in the Torah, and they are two entirely different prohibitions. The prohibition in this week's parasha is an issur of levisha, and it's an issur to do the act of levisha in a way that relates to both tzemeh and pishtim together, which requires that they be connected, but they can be connected in any way whatsoever. Whereas the prohibition in Parashat Kedoshim is a different prohibition. It's a prohibition of ha'alat Sha'atnez ala guf. The person, if has a beged kilaim, something which is defined as a beged kilaim, it's asa for such a beged to be upon his guf in any way whatsoever, even though it's not an act of levisha. Based on the stark difference between these two issur, we would expect there would actually be two different issurim, two lavim, two mitzvot of Sha'atnez. And indeed, the Bahag counts two separate mitzvot. Of the 613 mitzvot, two separate prohibitions, one for Parashat Kedoshim and another one for Parashat Tetze. Most of the Shonim disagree, But even if they disagree, apparently it's because they hold that it's just two different ways to violate the same concept. The problem at the end of the day is that a person should not be joining together the strengths of wool and linen. Just there are two different ways to do it. One is to really join them together to create a new chefsed issur, and the other is the person should do an action which relates to both of them together. But the essence in both cases is the problem, as Rishonim explained, that there are two different kochot in the world, a koach of wool and koach of linen, and these kochot that we have to respect their distinction and not join them together. Finish off with a little bit of Tamei mitzvot, both the Ramban and the Rabbeinu Bechaya, but also Rishon from Bahas in his way, his more rationalistic way, describe this idea that you shouldn't be combining different types of forces and different types of concepts together, but respect the natural order that Hashem created. And there's one exception, which we said, which is when a person wears tzitzit, and only when a person tzitzit, also in the Bigdei Kahuna, you're allowed to wear Sha'atnez. Why there is it different? So each shitter in its way explains that basically when a person is generally throughout his normal life, so in the world of Chulin, a person should be careful to only use each koach separately and recognize the distinctions of each different type of thing in the world and keep them separate. But once a person enters the world of Kedusha, of Bigdei Kahuna, of Tzitzit, which are a type of Bigdei Kahuna for each and every individual, so then a person wants to use all the kochot together, and dafka there, it's permitted to wear Sha'atnez. Shabbat Shalom.